Today I will talk to you about a couple of projects we're doing at CRA in fusion, and give you a bit of background about safety for fusion as well. I'll start with a bit of an overview about what fusion is. I know everybody probably knows, but bear with me. And then we'll discuss what are the current safety regulations around fusion at a high level, and then I'll go on and give an example, a couple of examples of what we're doing currently at CRA. So nuclear fusion happens in all the stars on Earth. We've managed to reproduce fusion using hydrogen isotopes. So we use a deuterium and a tritium nuclei, and we push them together, providing high energy. And what we obtain out of the fusion reaction is a helium nucleus plus a spare neutron. For this to happen successfully, we need the hydrogen isotope to be in plasma form, which means it's a high ionized gas at a high temperature. And we need as well from a high quality void, so there shouldn't be any other random particles other than the gas in the environment. We need a high temperature because so the energy needed to start the reaction is high. And we need a strong magnetic field to contain the ionized gas, so the plasma. We managed to reproduce these conditions in something called a Tokamak, which contains the plasma through a magnetic field. And we also usually need a high energy pulse to start the fusion reactor. And this is usually provided by someone like National Grid. We've built a few Tokamaks so far, but none of them have managed to this day to hold a self-sustaining fusion reaction for more than a few seconds. I think the current record is held by JET, which is the Joint European Fusion Torus, and it's in Culham. So if you're in the UK and you want to go have a look around, you can probably go and visit. They're usually quite happy to show you around if they're not doing experimental work. ITER, which is being currently built in the south of France, is the next iteration of fusion reactor, and it's intended to prove that we can have a self-sustaining fusion reactor, which means that we'll need to start the reaction with high energy pulse, but then it won't need any more energy to keep going. It will be self-sustaining. And then demo, which I will talk a little bit in the second part of my talk, it's currently being designed. It's in the pre-conceptual design phase, and it will be a fusion power plant. That's the idea. It would be a demonstrator fusion power plant, so it should be able to produce electricity, although it won't be connected to the grid, I think, at any point. At least they don't think they will. And for nuclear safety, for fusion, currently, at least in this country, but I've done a bit of research in most of the countries, fusion installations are considered nuclear installations. That means that they are under the same regulatory requirements than fission installation, so the rest of the civil nuclear. In the UK, this means that fusion reactors fall under the Nuclear Installation Act, which regulates licensed nuclear sites. And the Act states that basically there should be no harm to the environment, to the people, or to any property that comes from basically either radiation or any of the hazards associated with radiation or any other hazardous activity occurring at a nuclear installation. For ITER, which is currently being built, this means they use the regulatory requirements that they use for the civil reactor fleets, and they are sort of enforced by IRSN. That's the the French Institute for Radioprotection and Nuclear Safety. For ITER, because they were complying with civil nuclear regulation, they had to perform a safety analysis before they started building the Tokamak and the reactor, and they had to identify possible accident scenarios. And clearly, because we're talking about fusion, the accident scenarios look very different from what we're used to in the civil nuclear industry. I've put a small list here. I've read a couple of good papers about this, so if anybody is really interested in this, I can point you to a couple of research paper. But basically, we don't have nuclear fuel in solid form, but we have a lot of hydrogen up plants. So there are a lot of accidents that have to do with hydrogen explosion, and this can happen in the vessel, so in the Tokamak, and X vessel in the hydrogen storage areas. There's also a risk of radioactive leaks because tritium is radioactive, and if it's not accounted for properly, there is a risk of radioactive leaks. And there is no coolant that is liquid, like in like water reactors. So there are no like locus kind of accidents, but they worry about either loss of helium cryogen in cryolines or in cryocooling components, and they worry a lot about loss of vacuum accidents, which can compromise the sort of operability. Surely they can compromise the operability of the Tokamak. Which, I mean, as a nuclear engineer, I found this list very fascinating because it's very different to what I'm used to seeing for various civil nuclear plants. I'll then say that at CRA we have a lot of experience doing safety case and PSA, probabilistic safety assessment for our clients, and we've worked in a wide variety of nuclear fission technology. But I think for us, working with fusion is quite a new endeavor. We have got a couple of projects so far. One of the projects, which is for ITER, and they're looking at some of the test blanket modules that are basically introduced into the Tokamak, into the vessel of ITER, to test various different designs of blankets. And we're doing a RAMI analysis for a RAMI. I think most of you will be familiar with RAMs, which is reliability, availability, and maintainability. And the I in RAMI stands for inspectability, so the ability to go and check if everything is okay, basically. And this particular blanket design we're working on is an helium-cooled pebble bed, and we're looking at one of the subsystems, which is the neutron activation system. I will explain about this in a second. The other project we have ongoing, we just started on this, it's an optioneering study to identify seismic mitigation solutions for the current preconceptual design of the remote maintenance handling tool, a demo. I will now talk a little bit about the first project, and then after that I'll have a bit of a talk about the second project. So ITER, it's sort of an experimental reactor. They don't have a blanket. They're not breeding tritium. That will then be used for the fusion reactor. But they're testing different blanket models, and the idea is that the blankets will all have some lithium in them, and once lithium is exposed to a neutron flux, there is a transmutation of lithium into tritium, and then the tritium can be extracted and put back into the system to then be used as fuel for the fusion reaction. The the EU is responsible for sort of testing 2 of the blanket designs. One is a water-cooled lithium-lead blanket, and the other one is an helium-cooled pebble bed blanket. Our client for this project is a Spanish company, design engineering company, IDEM, and they won a framework for the preliminary design of the helium-cooled pebble bed blankets ancillary systems. In this design, lithium ceramic pebbles are used as a breeding material, and they also have beryllium pebbles that get sort of hit by the neutron flux, and if beryllium is hit by neutrons, it acts as a multiplier, so it produces more neutrons, which then increases the chances of the lithium being transmuted into tritium. And the test blanket would be located in a port of the ITER vacuum vessel to maximize the exposure to the neutron flux. This is valid for both design of test blankets. The helium-cooled pebble bed test blanket has some ancillary systems that ensure it's like optimal operability, and some of them, a couple of them are, one of them is a cooling system to keep it, to remove heat. Then we have a coolant purification system that keeps the helium so free from impurities. There is a tritium extraction system, and then there is a neutron activation system. CRA is working mostly on a neutron activation system, Rami, at the moment. The neutron activation system is basically a test. It's a supporting system that sort of analyzes how much flux, neutron flux, has been produced in the blankets, and whether basically enough lithium has been produced from irradiation enough tritium has been produced from irradiation from the lithium. The Rami we had 3 steps. The first step was the functional analysis. The second step was the meter, and then the last step was reliability and block diagram analysis to sort of quantify the availability. I have a slide that shows you what the Null system looks like. You should focus on the fat pipes and ignore the thin lines. But basically, this is a pneumatic system that's based on helium, pressurized helium, and the system basically a capsule, a pebble. It enters the system from this particular pipe. It's the second pipe vertical. It's the second vertical pipe from the left. It goes into the carousel. The carousel then can rotate and shift the capsule around. So the capsule sort of enter the leftmost pipe, which will then push the capsule to the transfer station. And in the transfer station is then directed to either one of the radiation end, whichever one is free. And in the irradiation end is in the vacuum vessel, so that's where the capsule is sort of exposed to the neutron flux. The time of exposure varies depending on what sort of test is being performed. Once the capsule has been irradiated for long enough, it needs to go back to the process room so that they can measure what sort of level of neutron flux it has been exposed to. So it's through this pumping system, it's pushed back to the transfer station here, and then goes back into the carousel, and then the carousel shifts around again, and it goes first into one of the counting stations where spectroscopy is performed, so they see what the neutron exposure was, the neutron fluence, the neutron flux, and then once that measurements have been concluded, goes back into the carousel and goes into the capsule bin, and it's disposed. And then while this is done, I think a new capsule starts its journey to the irradiation end and to exposure time. All those really thin blue pipes, lines, represent the helium gas, return pipes, because all of the movement is achieved through pressure difference in the helium, and clearly the gas needs to be able to go back to the helium tanks, and it's pushed around by a compressor. I've also put this like pinkish reddish squares around to highlight where the equipment is sitting. So this the carousel and the loading and the measurement is done in a process room, which is very much outside the vessel, and it's accessible, I expect, most of at least during maintenance time, short-term maintenance, but the port cell is only accessible during long-term maintenance, and this creates problems for availability of equipment. And if something happens in this area, basically the whole system isn't available because it can't be easily accessed and repaired, basically. So during our RAM analysis, these are the steps, and I'm just explaining a bit what each step means. During a functional analysis, we've identified which are the components that form a part of the system and what are the functions, so what it is they need to achieve for the system to be successful. Then during the FMICA, we identified the failure modes for each component and which failure modes are critical, so which failure modes potentially cause unavailability of the entire system. And then in the reliability bug diagram phase, we've quantified what is the availability of the entire system based on what we identified in the FMICA. And we also then identify which failure modes are the most significant and contribute most to the overall unavailability of the system. I haven't got time to go into the details of the analysis, but I will discuss a bit what we found out. So for the system design as it is, and as the system is still in the design phase, it could be changed and adapted in the future, but the current system has an availability of 80%, and the most significant failure mode was a blockage of the transfer line pipe work at the port cell. So as I mentioned earlier, because the port cell isn't easily accessible at all times, but it can be accessed only during long-term maintenance. If there is a blockage of the transfer line, we're basically losing the system until we get to long-term maintenance. So to improve the availability of the entire system, my colleagues put together an action plan where they made some recommendations to the design engineers, suggesting changes to the current design, which could improve the availability of the system and we then rerun the reliability block diagram analysis, assuming that all the recommendations we made were fully implementable. This might not be the case because of constraints on the design. But if all the recommendations we made were implemented, the overall availability over 2 years would go from 80% to 97%. This is it's a significant increase. It's about a fifth higher. And also, I guess the most significant failure mode would change from being a blockage in the transfer line pipework to be a blockage further upstream in the irradiation ends. And I think because those irradiation ends are in the vessel, I think there is the same problem of them not being accessible until long-term maintenance, basically. And there are two radiation hands, and the blockage of either hand has the same risk significance. So this is, I think, this is what we've provided to the client. I think there might be further iteration of this analysis if they change the design partially. They might want to know what the updated availability is. But I think this is with sort of the end of this project. And this is the other project I'm going to talk about. It's about mitigation strategy against seismic events for a remote blanket handling tool. I'll first sort of explain a little bit what demo is, and then we'll go through the sort of project scope. This project, we've just started it about 2-3 weeks ago, so we haven't got results yet. But it's a good project because it sets the scene and it shows how difficult things are in fusion. From an engineering point of view. So demo, as I said, is a demonstration power plant with follow ITER. This is the timeline. I think the timeline has already split a bit, but at the moment we are in the conceptual study phase, so this red bit, and our client RAIS is working on the remote maintenance as part of the Eurofusion consortium. And they are trying to substantiate what sort of technologies they would use for remote maintenance at demo. And why do we need remote maintenance? Because the environment is very harsh. So if you imagine at the center of the machine, at the center of the Tokamak, when the Tokamak is switched off, the radioactivity is 2000 gray per hour. This is way more than what we get in a fission reactor. And in the on top of the vessel, so in the operation areas where so once the vessel is closed, you still get 200 to 200 grays an hour in that, so around the access port. But it's not just sort of radiation the problem. They're also going to have a high ambient temperature to contend with. So they'll have a 50 degrees ambient temperature, and the components will all be really warm still, so about 120 degrees. There'll be a residual magnetic field from the Tokamak, which can sort of change behavior of metals and create problems. And then also because within the Tokamak itself and the vessel, they want high vacuum, high quality vacuum during operations. They need, when they are doing maintenance, they need to prevent debris and dirt to get into the vessel as much as they can, which means there are restrictions on lubricants, oils, fluids and dust. So everything needs to be like really clean all the time. But the good news is, I guess the only bit of good news is the maintenance takes place at atmospheric pressure. So there aren't any issues of high pressure environments. Because of all these conditions, we can't really send people anywhere near the vessel, and we need to perform the maintenance remotely by through robots. The project scope is we are in partnership, CRAs in partnership with our system for this project, and our system provides the sort of design, engineering expertise, and we provide the safety expertise. The scope of this project is to minimize the seismic loads that are transferred to the remote maintenance equipment during an earthquake, and for those loads that can't be minimized, we need to identify asset protection technologies, so things that will minimize the risk of structural damage to the maintenance equipment and also to the blanket segments. I'll explain this in a moment. And also we have to review the requirements and see whether we can reduce the requirements, the need for certain design requirements, maybe by using things like time at risk arguments. For whichever solutions we find to the problem of seismic mitigation, we also have to provide an expert opinion on how likely the regulator will be to approve this so the final design. So what it is that the remote maintenance tool needs to do. So this is the preliminary design. There is a giant concrete shield, and this ear-shaped structure is the vessel. The vessel is covered by a blanket, and the idea is that the blanket gets irradiated with neutron flux. The blanket contains lithium. The lithium gets transmuted into tritium, and once enough tritium is in the blanket needs to be removed so that the tritium can be extracted, and then new blanket segments can be placed back into the reactor to be irradiated further. All of this is still in the pre-conceptual design phases, as I've explained during the ITER. So a project, they have various designs for the blankets. They haven't still finalized what kind of blanket they want to use. And also they have different designs for the plasma shapes, and they haven't really finalized what they want to use. A single null blanket, which has only one diverter at the bottom of the vessel, or if they want two nulls. But in this talk, the design we're using, well, not just in this talk, in the project, we're focusing on a single null full blanket design, and the blanket is a lithium-lead blanket design, which is water cooled. And the remote handling tools need to perform, needs to be able to access the blanket from a port that's at the top of the vessel, and needs to be able to extract blanket segments. And to be able to do that, we can't just have a straight lift, which is what we normally do in fission reactors, where our fuel rods are just sort of lifted out from the top of the vessel. But the tool needs to basically rotate the blanket in various directions, which, as is shown in the sequence, before it's able to just pull it straight out of the port. And remember, blanket segments will be radioactive because they've been irradiated by neutron flux to produce tritium, and tritium itself is radioactive. So from an engineering point of view, this is a bit of a nightmare. This is made further complicated by the fact that there are 5 blanket segments that need to be extracted per port, and there are only 16 access ports at the top of the vessel, and each port has this strange trapezoidal shape, which makes lifts a bit of a nightmare. Thankfully, this operation needs to be performed only every 2 to 5 years, so it's not very frequent. But the blanket segments are very tightly packed, so that there isn't much clearance between them. And this is to protect the vessel and, I guess, maximize irradiation. And also, the blanket segments are really big. They are 10 meters tall, and in each of them weighs up to 80 tons. So as you can see from an engineering point of view, a design engineering point of view, it's a bit of a nightmare. And they had to design a very complex blanket handler tool to be able to perform this lift. They have at this stage, there are various possible designs for the blanket handler. The project has been focusing on something called the hybrid kinematic mechanism. It's a tool, tool about 10 meters, and it's quite slender, which creates complications when it's it's shaken by an earthquake, basically. And this tool also has 6 degrees of freedom, which allow it to perform those complex torsion and twisting motions that are needed to detach the blanket from the vessel and to then be able to lift them. And then these are like there are 3 actuators at the top, 2 more actuators on the side. There is a lid screw which goes all the way down here. That sort of sustains most of the structure. And they have RAIS has already performed some preliminary finite element analysis to determine what the peak loads are under seismic stresses, and whether the design is actually feasible at all. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're reviewing the finite element analysis. This includes responses on the seismic load. We are also reviewing safety regulations both from the ONR and international regulatory requirements for drop load safety cases, and also for the seismic case within the drop load. We're also trying to understand what the role of the blanket handler control system is in all of this. This is because as the system is remotely operated, it's basically a robot. It will have a bespoke CNI system, and at the moment, there is no plan for having an operator backup, which could be a problem from a regulatory point of view. What we are working towards is a discussion of potential engineering solutions that will mitigate the effect of seismic-induced acceleration on the blanket handler and on the suspended, and consequentially on the suspended blanket segments. And then we'll try to understand whether the solutions are feasible, not just from an engineering point of view, but from a safety regulator point of view. This is the end of my talk, actually. We've made some progress in this part of the project, which, if you guys have questions about, I'm happy to discuss a little bit about it. But we still haven't finished the project, so we haven't got any firm solutions to the issues we're looking at.
Great, thank you, Lavinia. It's so interesting to hear about what you're doing in terms of fusion, especially brings back some memories for me personally, having done some work on demo all about nearly 3 years ago, and actually also done a tour of JET. So it's great to see there's some traction being made and the work is progressing. So we have time for one question, I think, because we need to make sure our panelists are getting ready behind the scenes. So we got a question from Mano. Very good presentation. It is good to see that simple RAMS techniques can make a big difference to the reliability and availability of the systems. Do you know if fusion reactors need to adhere to the same regulatory standards as fission reactors?
Yes, I mean, I think they have to at the moment. I know that a lot of fusion specialists, especially in design engineering teams, are not so happy about having to adhere to the same standards and regulations that we use for fission. But at the moment, that is what it is, and you can't. I expect as we progress with the technology, there might be changes in standards and regulation. The biggest difference is there is no risk of having a molten core basically in a fusion reactor. But as you saw from my presentation, the radiation generates near in the vessel is really high. So it will probably depend on what systems we're designing. Some of them we might have to have the similar level of requirements and design standards used, and some of them might have more relaxed standards depending on how important they are for safety.